This movie is about selecting columns and rows and adjusting the row height and the column width. When we're working within our workbook on our worksheet, one of the things that we're going to be working with is the columns and the rows. We're going to have to change the column width and adjust the row height to accommodate the content and the data that's contained within the cells. In order to accomplish those things, we need to select the columns and we need to select the rows. The way to select a column is simply to left-click the column header, and I've selected column F. To select a series of columns, I can select column F, hold down the left mouse button, and just drag over to column I, for instance, and I've selected these contiguous columns. To select non-contiguous columns, from here we press the control key down and hold it down, left-click on another range of columns and drag over, and now I've selected two non-contiguous ranges. I'll left click off of that and show you that rows work exactly the same way. I've dragged across rows 6 to 10, hold the control key down, drag from 15 to 18. I have two non-contiguous ranges selected at this point. Now that we know how to select columns and rows, we can change some of the properties of the columns and rows. I'm going to go up and left click the edge of column I and hold my mouse button down. It says 8.38 72 pixels. What does that mean? 8.38 is the character spaces. That's 8.38 character spaces wide, which is the default width for the font that's established for Excel at this point, which is Arial. 72 pixels, which is 3/4 of an inch. 96 pixels is an inch. 72 is 3/4 of 96, so that's 3/4 of an inch. There is a point to be made about the 8.38 measurement, which is the number of characters wide the column is, and that is that it's based on the font that's established as the default font for the workbook. Right now the default font is Arial. The width for the column is again 8.38 character spaces. If you change the default font from Arial to something else where the characters have a wider or narrower range that they need to be contained within, you'll see that 8.38 change to a different number. Not a big deal, but that's where that measurement comes from. The row height is measured in a different way. It has pixels, but it also has a height of 14.25. 14.25 is the point size. So currently we have Arial 11 point. It will fit in that cell because it's higher than the 11 point font itself. It accommodates the point size of the font. Once again, if you change the default font to be something other than Arial and it requires more space to be displayed in the row, the default row height will change and adjust accordingly. In another movie, we'll show you how to change those defaults, by the way. So we have the row height being measured in points and pixels, and we have the column width being measured in character spaces and pixels. If you would rather be looking at a unit of measure that's more familiar, like inches, there's a way to do that, and that is to switch to the page layout view by left-clicking this icon right here. At the top and the left of the page, there's a ruler that will map out for you the width of your columns and the height of your rows. This may be an easier way to do some adjusting rather than using pixels. I'll go back to the normal view by left-clicking this icon. So now that we know what the default height of the rows are and the width of the columns are, and we know how to select columns and rows, we can now change the row height and the column width. The way that is done is to make a selection. I'll left-click F to I, hold down the control key, select L to M, and Q and R. So I've got three non-contiguous ranges selected at this point. Checking the current width, it's 8.38, 8.38. They will all be that size. When I hover over the left or right side of the column and I get this bar with two arrows, one pointing left, one pointing right, I can hold down the left mouse button and drag to the left to make all of the columns, it looks like it's just going to do H, but it'll do all of them, either narrower or wider. In this case, I'm going to make them wider. I'll go to 15.25 when I release. All of the selected columns simultaneously size to the exact same size as we saw on column H, which is 15.25, 15.25, 15.25, and so on. The rows work exactly the same way. You can adjust the height of the rows simultaneously with contiguous and non-contiguous selection choices. There is a limit to the width of the column and the height of the rows. I'll start with the rows. I'll left click off of my selections of those columns and select row 3, get my bar with the, now this case, up and down arrow. The default height is 14.25 pixels. The largest this row will ever get is 409.5 points. When I release, I have 409.5 points. It just won't get any larger than that. I'll left click to deselect that row. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, otherwise I won't have enough room to show you the maximum width of the column. I'm going to select A and drag over. The maximum width is reported to be 255 character spaces. It says 254.88, close enough. When I release, it becomes 254.88. So that's the maximum width for the column and the maximum height for the rows. You can't make them any larger. So we saw how to select contiguous columns and rows and non-contiguous columns and rows. We talked about the default width and height of the columns and rows and how that is a function of the font and the point size of the font that's selected as the default. We also saw the maximum height of the rows and the maximum width of the columns, and how we can change the row height and the column width simultaneously for our selected columns and our selected rows.